We'll come back to all of this with my panel. I want you to stay there because you'll be a part of the panel. I want to bring them in though now because we've had a whole lot of newsworthy issues today. I have to say some have been serious and some have been quite ridiculous. Let's start with the serious. Former boss of ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, Duncan Lewis, has warned that the Chinese government is looking to take over Australia's political system. Now, for someone like Duncan Lewis to put that in such express terms, I have to say to you, I've worked with Duncan Lewis, it's serious. He says that any person in Australian politics is a potential target and that we may not see the full impact of China's foreign interference operations for decades. And now the ridiculous. I promised you ridiculous. Well, this is ridiculous. Local bureaucratic red tape is officially out of control with a story in Melbourne today. The children are only being provided safe passage across half of a busy 8-lane crossing of a major road in Melbourne because this road is the dividing line between two local council areas. And one council says supervision is necessary and the other council says it's not prepared to pay their half. This is true. So Port Phillip Council has paid for a lollipop man to supervise children crossing 4 lanes of the Punt Road overpass. The other 4 lanes fall under the Stonington Council and they don't believe a lollipop man or lollipop woman or, God, I don't even know what you can say anymore, is needed. Now, this is an 8-lane major arterial road in an inner city of one of Australia's largest cities. There you go. We'll talk about that. Dr. Kevin Donnelly, he's still with us. I also want to bring in journalist Kel Richards and writer Corinne Barraclough. But before we do, let's just have a look. I've got a bit of a package of the news in review. Let's have a look at that first and we'll come back.
Outlining his vision for the economy.
Queensland, like the nation, has the potential for a great future.
Anthony Albanese travelled to the Sunshine State for his second vision statement, a state where Labor needs to gain ground before the next election.
Labor has learned the lessons from our recent mistakes.
His approach causing the Home Affairs Minister to make this concession.
I think Anthony Albanese is a bigger threat than Bill Shorten and a bigger threat, frankly, than even Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard.
Mr Albanese's first vision statement was a pitch on jobs. This time, the Labor leader pitched his productivity renewal project.
To lift investment in infrastructure, to lift business investment and to invest in the skills of our people.
Moving away from the so-called tax and spend agenda of Bill Shorten, Mr Albanese has embraced the need to cut red tape, declaring he'd demonstrate a fiscally responsible approach.
I want our economic framework to have a soft heart and a hard head.
Know this about Anthony Albanese, he is a tax and spend guy. He'll tell you whatever you want to hear in opposition, but if he ever becomes Prime Minister of this country, he'll destroy the budget.
As for the consistent coalition criticism that Labor lacks any appreciation for aspiration, Mr Albanese finished on this.
Now is no time to lower our aspirations. It's time to raise them.
The former head of ASIO, meanwhile, raised issues of his own, delivering a stark warning when it comes to Chinese interference. Duncan Lewis argues Beijing is attempting to take over Australia's political system. He labelled the threat as insidious and called on Chinese Australians to work with security agencies to identify the threat. The Prime Minister says the government is on top of the issue.
Our position, our laws, our resources, our agencies have never been better tasked, and I've got to say Duncan played a huge role in getting us in that position.
Peter Dutton also defending the intelligence agencies after this attack from one former Prime Minister.
The subtleties of foreign policy and the elasticity of diplomacy are being supplanted by the phobias of a group of security agencies which are now effectively running the foreign policy of the country.
I think, frankly, Mr Albanese should condemn those comments, and I think they reflect more on Mr Keating than they do on any of our agency heads.
But there's no appetite within Labor to do so, saying Mr Keating can speak for himself. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
Yeah, well, Mr Keating can speak for himself, but I just do wish every time he speaks about China, he would declare that he's a board member of a Chinese communist-connected bank. But anyway, I'll bring in my panel, wonderful panel. I want to start, if I can, with you, Kel. We'll start on this issue of the ASIO warning. It's about as serious as you can get. It's not an ASIO warning, let me correct that. It's a warning from a former ASIO chief. But he names China, he's quite specific, and as you know, in intelligence circles, it's not the immediate contact that you want to return on, it's contact going over decades. They play the very long game in China. They're in and out of our universities. They're obviously heavily involved in our economy. They're buying up land, they're buying up institutions. It sounds pretty serious.
It certainly does, and we know of the examples. We know of Sam Dastyari and what happened there. We know that in 2005 there was a Chinese diplomat who defected to Australia, and he talked about the number of spies that China had operating in Australia. So the warning that we've got is a genuine warning. Can I say, Peter, my worry to some extent is not China. China is run by a communist party, and it functions the way communists function, and you can trust them to be communists, okay? That's how they're going to operate. My worry is our politicians in Australia. Australian governments have leased the Port of Darwin for 99 years to China. Now, what kind of mentality is doing that? I worry that even our present government is more concerned about keeping our trade with China intact than protecting us from that level of influence. This is a kind of trade-off. Let's grab the money and let's not worry about what else is going on in the background. So, yes, there's a worry with China, but I'm also a bit worried about our politicians, perhaps unfairly, but I am.
Yes, well, I'd follow the money trail, Corinne, wouldn't you, and see where many of them end up when they leave political life, what sort of financial incentives they might have, what sort of jobs they end up on, boards they end up. I just mentioned Paul Keating, but there are plenty of others on both sides of politics. That's the worry.
Absolutely, and you're right, follow that trail. I think the term that was used coming from Lewis's words was sensible awareness from politicians, and wouldn't we hope for a little bit more sensible awareness from all of our politicians? But Dastyari is the example that comes straight to mind.
I want to go to the issue of Westpac. I was just talking to Kevin Donnelly about political correctness, and I really went for Westpac, I think quite appropriately in my opening remarks tonight, because here is a bank that's been less about being a bank and more about an activist on climate change issues in particular, refused to lend to Adani in 2017, made it a case of high principle. But of course there's no principle in allowing or facilitating the exchange of funds between pedophiles in Australia and the rape of children in the Philippines. They think it's all okay. They've wrung their hands, they've put out their statement saying, I'm very, very sorry, but there's not one person involved in the bank tonight who's had a personal impact, ramification from this, you know, 24, 23 million breaches. Kevin, we haven't had a head roll, we haven't had anyone sacked, we haven't even had a resignation. It's not good enough.
Well, it's an appalling indictment of what Westpac has done, but there are other corporations, whether it's Qantas or NAB, over the last couple of years, they seem more concerned about, as you said, virtue signalling, about whether it's the environment or Indigenous affairs or gender or getting boards that are supposedly balanced, often that fail to do their job. Now, some of those issues are worthwhile, so I can understand why there's a move to actually deal with them. But I'm old-fashioned. I believe if you're a shareholder, then your concern is if you've invested money, if it's part of your superannuation in particular, then you want whoever has that money to give you better value in terms of being efficient, being cost-effective, you know, making sure that you don't waste money or spend money on these programs that really have no value in terms of the business. The other thing is, if I could finish, is as a customer, and I fly Qantas quite a bit, I'm more concerned about whether the flights are on time or not. The last two times I've flown with Qantas, they've been 20, 30 minutes late. And when I talk to some of the flight attendants about political correctness, for example, and using gender-free pronouns, they laugh and say, look, it's okay, darling, use whatever language you want.
Kel, just on the Westpac issue, you'd think after the Banking Royal Commission, I think we all hoped at least, there'd be a cultural change by these banks. But I really feel the last 24 hours demonstrates, this example of Westpac is pretty egregious, that they haven't listened and they've got a tin ear.
I think the only response from us can be outrage. I mean, how can this not be incompetence? How can this not be massive collective incompetence? 23 million violations. There's something seriously wrong in the entire structure. There's something seriously wrong in the reporting system. Now, as you point out, we should be outraged that Brian Hartson, the CEO, hasn't resigned already and the chairman hasn't resigned already. I'm not a betting person, but I'd be prepared to bet you $1 that in a week's time Brian Hartson will be gone. I cannot see how he can possibly survive an organisation with 23 million violations. I think they're worried about two things. They are, as Kevin said, worried about virtue signalling. They want to climb Mount Virtue, wave their flag from the top. But I think they're also got a big view on bonuses. These are people who are keeping the share price up, keeping their bonuses rolling in. That's what matters more than the proper structure, the proper lines of reporting, the proper care, the proper compliance. So I think they're focusing on two things and they're both the wrong thing. And I cannot see how any CEO of an organisation with this big a failure can survive.
No. Yeah, well, I'll give you a tip before we go to a break about how corporate management of these things works, right? They'll try and hang on to the CEO as long as they can so that he sops up as much of this angst from people like me in the media tonight and consumers and others. And then next week, he'll disappear and they'll think that in cutting him down and removing him from the business, he will take with them the angst and it will save, the board hopes, their own jobs. And their own jobs, not just in Westpac, but of course their own jobs in multiple boards, because boards in Australia are a club. But we'll see. NAB very clearly lost its CEO and its chairman. We'll take a quick break and be back with more.